The Adriatic Sea lay still as black glass on the night of December 18, 1941. No moon hung in the winter sky. The air tasted of salt and cold iron, and the water held its breath. In the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt, the lights of the British Mediterranean fleet shimmered like distant stars against the inky surface. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers arranged in perfect military geometry, their hulls dark fortresses of riveted steel. Somewhere in the blackness beyond the harbor mouth, beneath the surface where no eye could follow, 3 men rode machines that should not have existed. They wore rubber suits that sealed them against the cold. Their faces were hidden behind breathing apparatus that bubbled softly in the silence. Beneath them, between their legs, long torpedo-shaped devices churned forward through the water at walking pace. Primitive by later standards, but revolutionary in that moment. Human-guided torpedoes, piloted chariots of underwater war. These were the men of the Decima Flottiglia Mass, the 10th Light Flotilla of the Regia Marina, the Royal Italian Navy. And on this night, they were about to do something that would rewrite the rules of naval warfare forever. Luigi Durand de la Penne sat astride his chariot, his breath steady inside the mask, his hands gripping the controls with the confidence of a man who had trained for this moment through countless hours in cold water and darker nights. Behind him, his partner Emilio Bianchi held tight to the torpedo's frame as they slipped past the outer defenses of the British anchorage. To their left and right, invisible in the black water, 2 other teams rode their own chariots toward their own targets. Their mission was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Penetrate the most heavily defended naval base in the Mediterranean, attach explosive charges to the hulls of British capital ships, and escape before dawn revealed what they had done. This was not supposed to be possible. Every admiral, every naval strategist, every military mind of the era understood one fundamental truth. Harbors were sanctuaries. Defended harbors were fortresses, and heavily defended harbors like Alexandria, ringed with anti-submarine nets, patrolled by destroyers, swept by searchlights, guarded by thousands of trained men with orders to kill anything that moved in the water without authorization. These were considered absolutely impenetrable. The British believed it. Their sailors slept soundly in their bunks, confident in the steel walls that surrounded them and the vast machinery of their fleet's protection. The Italians knew better, or rather, they had decided to believe something different. The story begins not in Alexandria, but in the peculiar laboratories and training facilities of La Spezia, on Italy's northwestern coast, where in the late 1930s, a group of Italian naval officers had become obsessed with an idea that most of their colleagues considered suicidal. The idea was this: if you could not defeat the enemy's fleet in open battle, if your ships were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched, then you must find a way to reach the enemy, where he believed himself invincible. You must go where he does not expect you. You must become invisible. The concept of the human torpedo, the mile as the Italians affectionately called it, the pig named for its stubborn handling characteristics, emerged from this obsession. It was not a true torpedo in the explosive sense. It was a slow, battery-powered underwater vehicle, approximately 22 feet long, designed to be ridden by 2 men in diving suits. The warhead, containing several hundred pounds of high explosive, could be detached and clamped to the hull of an enemy ship with a time-delayed fuse. The operators would then, theoretically, escape before the charge detonated, making their way to a pickup point or to shore. Theoretically. The men who volunteered for this duty were not typical sailors. They were swimmers, divers, athletes, men comfortable in the water in ways that most naval personnel were not. They trained in frigid conditions, learning to operate in zero visibility, to navigate by compass and instinct, to hold their breath when equipment failed, to remain calm when every instinct screamed panic. They practiced attaching charges to the hulls of Italian ships in friendly harbors, perfecting their techniques until they could work in total darkness, by touch alone. They learned to cut through anti-submarine nets with special tools. They studied British harbor defenses from intelligence photographs and reports, memorizing the layouts of anchorages they had never seen, and they learned to accept that they might not return. By 1940, as Italy entered the war alongside Germany, the Decima Flottiglia Mass had become one of the most elite and secretive units in any navy. Their first operations, launched against British positions in the Mediterranean, met with mixed results. Some failures, some near successes, and a growing understanding of what worked and what did not. The British, for their part, captured some equipment and took some prisoners, but they did not fully grasp what they were facing. The idea seemed too fantastical, too much like something from a boy's adventure story. Men riding torpedoes through defended harbors? Surely not a serious threat. This underestimation would cost them dearly. Alexandria, in December 1941, was the beating heart of British naval power in the eastern Mediterranean. The fleet anchored there represented not just military strength, but imperial prestige. The visible symbol of Britain's determination to hold the sea lanes, protect Egypt and the Suez Canal, and maintain the connection between the home islands and the empire in the east. The battleships HMS Valiant and HMS Queen Elizabeth, each displacing more than 30,000 tons and mounting 8 15-inch guns, were the anchors of this fleet. Around them clustered cruisers, destroyers, support vessels, a small city of steel floating in the harbor. The Italians had tried to reach Alexandria before. Earlier attempts had been detected or had failed for technical reasons. But the men of the Decima Flottiglia were persistent learners. Each failure taught them something. Each near miss refined their methods. By late 1941, they believed they had solved the puzzle. The key was the submarine Cirré, a long-range boat modified to carry 3 chariots in external containers. The Cirré would transport the teams close to Alexandria, release them outside the harbor defenses, and wait for their return. Or not return, as fate determined. The operation was scheduled for mid-December. The crews were Luigi Durand de Penne and Emilio Bianchi, targeting HMS Valiant, Antonio Marseglia and Spartaco Shergat, targeting HMS Queen Elizabeth, and Vincenzo Martellotta and Mario Marino, targeting a large tanker. Each team knew their assignments. Each had studied recognition silhouettes until they could identify their targets in the dark by shape alone. On the night of December 18, the Cirré surfaced briefly in the dark waters outside Alexandria. The crews, already suited and equipped, mounted their chariots. The hatches of the storage containers opened, and one by one the machines slipped into the water. There was no ceremony, no speeches, just the quiet splash of entry, the muffled sound of electric motors engaging, and then silence as the teams descended and began their slow approach. The entry into the harbor was the most dangerous phase. The British maintained anti-submarine nets across the main entrance, barriers designed to stop torpedoes and submarines. But the nets had gates that opened periodically to allow friendly vessels to pass. Intelligence had given the Italians the approximate schedules. Timing would be everything. In the black water, Durand de Penne navigated by compass and by counting his breathing. Distance and direction became mathematical exercises performed in cold and darkness. The chariot moved slowly, barely faster than a man could swim, its electric motor humming quietly. Above them, invisible, the surface of the harbor reflected searchlight beams that swept the water at irregular intervals. Behind them, Bianchi held on and watched for obstacles, his body pressed close to conserve heat and reduce drag. They reached the nets near midnight. By extraordinary fortune, or perhaps by calculated risk, a British destroyer was entering the harbor at that moment, and the gate stood open. Durand de Penne aimed his chariot at the opening, and accelerated as much as the machine allowed. They slipped through in the destroyer's wake, the net closing behind them with a metallic rattle that seemed impossibly loud in the water, but went unnoticed above. They were inside. Navigation in the harbor was a nightmare of obstacles and confusion. Mooring chains hung like forests of steel cables. The hulls of ships loomed out of the darkness without warning. Massive cliffs of metal that could crush the small chariot if struck. Durand de la Penne relied on dead reckoning and instinct, correcting his course by the shapes he glimpsed in the murk. The breathing apparatus worked imperfectly. The cold seeped through the rubber suit. The hours underwater sapped strength and focus. But training held. Muscle memory guided hands that could no longer feel the controls. Then, ahead, a shape larger than the others. A hull that curved upward like a wall, disappearing into the darkness above. The distinctive flare of a battleship's bow. HMS Valiant, Durand de la Penne guided the chariot down along the hull, feeling his way toward the keel. This was the critical moment, the attachment of the warhead. The charge had to be placed precisely, clamped beneath the ship where the explosion would rupture the hull plates and flood the interior compartments. He maneuvered the chariot into position, then signaled Bianchi to help detach the warhead. The mechanism jammed. In training, this procedure had taken minutes. Now, in the cold and dark, with fingers numbed and visibility zero, the clamps would not release. Durand de la Penne worked the mechanism, trying not to force it, knowing that damage could make the situation worse. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The time fuses on the warheads were already running, set before the mission began to ensure detonation at a coordinated moment. Delay now meant less time to escape. Finally, with a click that seemed loud as a gunshot, the warhead separated. Together, working by touch, the two men positioned it beneath the hull and set the clamps that would hold it in place. The fuse ticked silently in its waterproof housing, counting down toward dawn. Mission accomplished. Now they had to get out, but the effort had exhausted both men, and when Durand de la Penne tried to restart the chariot's motor for the escape, it would not engage. The battery, drained by the long approach and the delays, had no power left. They were stranded beneath an enemy battleship, with an explosive charge timed to detonate in a few hours, and no means of propulsion. There was nothing to do but swim. Durand de la Penne gestured to Bianchi, and they abandoned the chariot, kicking upward toward the surface. They broke into air near the stern of the Valiant, gasping, their breathing apparatus barely functional. Almost immediately, searchlights snapped onto them. Voices shouted in English. The rattle of rifle bolts echoed across the water. They were captured within minutes, hauled dripping and exhausted onto a British patrol boat. Their suits cut away, their equipment confiscated. They gave false names and refused to answer questions. The British, confused and suspicious, but not yet understanding what had occurred, locked them below decks on a support vessel nearby. But the charge beneath the Valiant's hull continued to tick. While Durand de la Penne and Bianchi were being interrogated, the other two teams completed their missions with greater success. Marsiglia and Shergat found HMS Queen Elizabeth, attached their charge without incident, and made their escape toward shore. They would eventually be captured on land, but not before the warhead did its work. Martellata and Marino targeted not a battleship, but the tanker Sagona and a destroyer, HMS Jervis, placing charges on both before slipping away into the pre-dawn darkness. As the eastern sky began to pale with the first hint of sunrise, Durand de la Penne made a decision that would define his legacy. He was being held aboard a ship very close to the Valiant, close enough that when the charge exploded, the blast would likely kill everyone nearby, including his captors and possibly himself. The British had no idea what was about to happen. They thought they had captured saboteurs attempting some minor operation. They did not know that hundreds of pounds of high explosives sat clamped to the hull of their battleship. Minutes from detonation. Durand de la Penne asked to speak to the captain of the Valiant. When the British officer arrived, skeptical and irritated, Durand de la Penne told him in clear English that there was a bomb beneath the ship, that it would explode very soon, and that everyone should evacuate immediately. He would not say how he knew this. He would not provide details, but his tone carried absolute conviction. The British officer faced an impossible decision. Was this a bluff? A trick? Or was this exhausted, bedraggled prisoner telling the truth? Minutes ticked by as he weighed the possibilities. Then, choosing caution, he ordered a partial evacuation of the Valiant, moving non-essential personnel away from the likely blast zone. At approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, the charge detonated. The explosion was not the Hollywood spectacle of flame and flying debris. It was underwater, muffled, a deep concussive thump that lifted the 30,000-ton battleship as if it were a toy and then dropped it back into the water. Inside the hull, the force punched through the armor plating and flooded the forward compartments. The ship settled lower in the water, listing slightly, wounded but not sinking in the shallow harbor. Damage control teams rushed to contain the flooding, shoring up bulkheads and pumping water, while on the deck above, sailors stared at each other in shock and confusion. Minutes later, a second explosion rocked the harbor. HMS Queen Elizabeth lurched as Marseglia's charge tore into her hull. Then a third blast as the tanker Saginaw erupted in flame, and a fourth as the destroyer Jervis shuddered under the impact of Martellotta's bomb. In the space of 15 minutes, the core of the British Mediterranean fleet had been crippled. Both battleships were out of action, one tanker destroyed, one destroyer badly damaged. No enemy ships had been sighted. No aircraft had attacked. No submarines had been detected. The defenses had not failed because they had never been triggered. The attack had come from within the sanctuary itself, delivered by men who had ridden invisible machines through barriers designed to stop conventional threats. The British could not comprehend it. Initial reports speculated about mines dropped from aircraft, or sabotage by local agents, or some new form of remote-controlled weapon. Only when the captured Italians were properly interrogated and the abandoned chariots were recovered and examined did the full picture emerge. And even then, it seemed impossible. How could 3 teams of men on primitive underwater vehicles accomplish what entire fleets had failed to do? The aftermath of the Alexandria Raid rippled far beyond the immediate damage to ships and schedules. In strategic terms, the attack forced the British to rethink their entire approach to harbor defense. Anti-submarine nets were reinforced. Patrol schedules were randomized. Underwater listening devices were deployed. Divers began routine inspections of ship hulls. Security procedures tightened to levels that would have seemed paranoid a month earlier. But the deeper impact was psychological. The raid shattered the assumption that defended harbors were safe. It demonstrated that determined attackers with specialized training and equipment could penetrate defenses that conventional forces could not breach. It opened a new chapter in naval warfare, one in which the human element, skill, courage, ingenuity, could overcome technological barriers that seemed insurmountable. The men of the Decima Flottiglia MS became legends, even among their enemies. British commandos studied their methods. Winston Churchill himself took note, remarking on the audacity and effectiveness of the operation. After the war, when the full records were declassified, military historians recognized the Alexandria Raid as a turning point, the moment when Special Operations Forces proved they could achieve strategic results, far beyond their numbers. Luigi Durand de la Penne spent the rest of the war as a prisoner, but his warning to the British captain earned him a measure of respect, even in captivity. Years later, the British government awarded him a military decoration for his conduct, an extraordinary gesture that acknowledged the difference between an honorable warrior and a common saboteur. He had placed a bomb that crippled a battleship, but he had also saved lives when he could have remained silent and let the explosion kill indiscriminately. This duality captures something essential about the Alexandria Raid. It was an act of war, destructive and effective, but carried out with a precision and discipline that separated it from terrorism or atrocity. The targets were military. The methods, though unconventional, followed the logic of warfare. And in the end, the attackers behaved not as fanatics, but as soldiers bound by codes that transcended nationality. To understand why the Alexandria Raid matters, we must place it in the larger context of the Mediterranean War in 1941. By December, the strategic situation had reached a critical balance. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June, opening the vast Eastern Front. In North Africa, Rommel's forces were battling British and Commonwealth troops for control of Libya and Egypt. The Mediterranean Sea itself had become a contested zone where neither side held clear superiority. Supply convoys ran deadly gauntlets through air and submarine attacks. Malta, the British island fortress, endured relentless bombing. Every ship, every soldier, every ton of supplies mattered. For Italy, the war had been a series of disappointments. Early hopes of quick victories had evaporated. The invasion of Greece had stalled and required German intervention. The fleet, though modern and powerful on paper, had been unable to decisively engage the British. Losses mounted while strategic gains remained elusive. National morale sagged under the weight of setbacks and sacrifices that seemed to produce no results. The Alexandria Raid changed that narrative, at least briefly. Here was a victory that could be celebrated. A daring operation that succeeded against overwhelming odds. A technological innovation that proved Italian ingenuity, a small group of heroes who accomplished what entire battle fleets had not. For a nation hungry for good news, the raid provided a moment of pride and vindication. But the celebration was short-lived. By December 1941, Italy was already on a trajectory toward defeat. The entry of the United States into the war after Pearl Harbor would tip the strategic balance irreversibly. Within 2 years, Italy would surrender, and the forces that had been allies would turn against each other in a bitter civil conflict. The men who rode chariots into Alexandria would find themselves in a world transformed, where the certainties they had fought for dissolved into chaos and compromise. Yet the raid's significance outlasted Italy's war effort. The techniques pioneered by the Decima Flottiglia MS influenced the development of special operations forces worldwide. The British created their own Human Torpedo program, using captured Italian equipment as a template. The Americans developed similar capabilities, which evolved eventually into the SEAL teams and other specialized units. The fundamental insight that small teams with specialized skills and equipment could achieve effects far beyond their size became a cornerstone of modern military doctrine. In this sense, the men who slipped through the darkness into Alexandria Harbor on that December night were not just warriors of their moment, but architects of a future they could not foresee. They demonstrated a principle that would shape warfare for generations, that the clever and the brave could, under the right circumstances, defeat the powerful and the complacent. What did those men feel as they rode their chariots through the black water? The historical record preserves actions and outcomes, but interior experience remains largely hidden. We know they were trained to suppress fear, to focus on procedure and execution rather than consequences. We know they accepted the possibility of death as an inevitable aspect of their mission. But beyond these externals, we can only imagine. Consider Luigi Durand della Penne in the hours before the raid. The quiet conversations with his partner, the final checks of equipment, the mental rehearsal of each step in the mission profile. Did he think of family, of home, of a future that might not exist beyond sunrise? Or did he narrow his focus to the immediate, the practical, the mechanical tasks that would carry him through the night? Men facing extreme danger often describe a strange clarity, a heightened awareness, combined with an almost dreamlike detachment. The body executes trained movements while the mind observes from a distance, recording but not quite experiencing. Underwater, in the cold and darkness, with the weight of the sea pressing down, and the knowledge that every minute brought him closer to enemy defenses or equipment failure or simple exhaustion, Durand de la Penne must have existed in a state of pure concentration. The world shrank to breath and compass, to the vibration of the motor and the pressure of water against his suit. There was no room for doubt, no space for reconsideration. The decision had been made on shore. Now there was only execution. When the warhead jammed, when minutes ticked away and the motor died, and the mission teetered on the edge of failure, what did he feel then? Frustration, certainly. Perhaps a spike of panic, quickly suppressed. Training took over. Troubleshoot, adapt, persist. And when the warhead finally locked into place and the task was complete, did he feel satisfaction? Relief? Or had he moved beyond such emotions into a zone where only survival mattered? His decision to warn the British remains the most revealing moment. After everything, the months of training, the dangerous approach, the mechanical failures, the capture, he chose to prioritize human life over military advantage. The bomb would explode whether he spoke or not. His warning could not stop it. But it could move people out of danger, could reduce casualties among men who happened to be enemies but were not, in the end, so different from himself. This choice defines the difference between a warrior and a killer, between military discipline and fanaticism. Durand de la Penne understood that his war was against ships and strategies, not against individual sailors who simply had the misfortune to serve on those ships. When circumstances allowed him to reduce suffering without compromising his mission, he did so. This conduct earned him respect even from those he had attacked, a respect that transcended the immediate conflict and spoke to something deeper in human nature. The recognition that even in war, certain principles remain worth upholding. The British sailors aboard HMS Valiant experienced the raid from the opposite perspective. As victims of an attack they could neither predict nor prevent. For them, December 18th began as an ordinary day in wartime, a mixture of routine duties, mild boredom, and the low-level anxiety that became background noise in a combat zone. The harbor was safe. Sentries walked their posts. Officers reviewed reports and schedules. Below decks, men played cards, wrote letters, slept in hammocks that swayed gently with the harbor's movement. When the explosion came at dawn, the sensation was of the world suddenly wrong. A ship the size of a battleship is not supposed to move that way, lifted and dropped like a stone into water. The sound was wrong, too. A deep concussion felt in the chest and bones rather than heard through the ears. Then alarms, shouting, the organized chaos of damage control as crews scrambled to assess what had happened and contain the consequences. Confusion reigned initially. No one had seen an attack. No torpedo had been spotted. No aircraft detected. Had a mine drifted into the harbor? Had something inside the ship exploded? Only gradually, as reports came in of other ships damaged, of strange underwater vehicles recovered, of prisoners who admitted to placing charges, did the truth emerge. And with the truth came a cold realization. Their fortress had been breached not by overwhelming force, but by stealth and ingenuity. The defenses had not failed catastrophically. They had simply been bypassed by an enemy clever enough to exploit gaps that no one had considered vulnerable. For the British Navy, an institution built on tradition and confidence in technological superiority, this realization stung deeply. It called into question assumptions about security and capability. It suggested that the enemy might possess skills and resources that intelligence had underestimated, and it meant that nowhere was truly safe. Not harbors, not anchorages, not even coastal bases far from the front lines. The response came in layers. Immediate measures focused on detection and prevention. More patrols, better nets, underwater defenses. But the deeper response involved a shift in mindset. The British began developing their own unconventional capabilities, not just to counter Italian chariots, but to apply similar principles to their own offensive operations. What the enemy could do to you, you must learn to do to them. Innovation met innovation in an escalating cycle of measures and countermeasures. Yet beneath the strategic calculations and tactical adjustments lay a human dimension that often gets overlooked. The sailors who served on those ships, who felt the explosion and watched their vessel settle lower in the water, who understood that they had come within minutes of death. Those men carried the experience differently than the planners and strategists. For them, the raid was personal. They had been attacked in what should have been safety. Their home, in the mobile sense that a ship becomes home to its crew, had been violated. This personal dimension matters because it shaped how those sailors approached the rest of their war. Some became more cautious, more suspicious, always watching the water for threats. Others grew harder, more determined to strike back at an enemy who had proven capable of such audacity. A few, perhaps, gained a grudging respect for opponents who had achieved something militarily brilliant, even while hating the consequences. War creates complicated emotions, and the Alexandria Raid produced all of them. If we step further back, examining the raid from the perspective of decades rather than days, a different picture emerges. The Alexandria operation was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger evolution in warfare that accelerated dramatically during the Second World War. The conflict forced innovations in technology, tactics, and organization that would have taken decades to develop in peacetime. Special operations forces, amphibious warfare, strategic bombing, electronic warfare, cryptography. All these domains exploded with new ideas and capabilities because the stakes demanded rapid adaptation. The Human Torpedo represented one thread in this tapestry of innovation. It emerged from a specific set of circumstances. Italy's need to compensate for conventional weakness, the Mediterranean theater's emphasis on naval power, the availability of skilled personnel willing to undertake extraordinary risks. But the underlying principle, using unconventional methods to attack enemies at their points of assumed security, transcended those specific circumstances. It became a template copied and adapted by multiple nations across multiple theaters. The British, as mentioned, developed their own chariot program. Operations against German-occupied harbors in Norway, Italy, and elsewhere applied lessons learned from being on the receiving end at Alexandria. The weapons improved, the training intensified, and the doctrine matured. By 1944, British Human Torpedo teams were conducting operations of considerable sophistication, though often at terrible cost. The German battleship Tirpitz, hiding in Norwegian fjords, became a repeated target for such attacks, reflecting how the concept had spread and evolved. American forces took longer to embrace similar approaches, but by the war's end, they too recognized the value of specialized underwater capabilities. The legacy of Alexandria thus flows directly into the post-war development of combat swimmer programs, which eventually produced units like the Navy SEALs. The title of this narrative deliberately invokes that connection. Navy SEALs appeared inside at dawn, because it captures the psychological essence of what the Decima Flottiglia Mass achieved. The sudden appearance of the enemy inside defenses believed impenetrable, at the moment when defenders are least prepared. This psychological dimension may be the raid's most enduring legacy. Physical damage can be repaired, ships can be refloated and restored. But the knowledge that an enemy can reach you anywhere, that no defense is absolute, that determined attackers will find ways through, that knowledge changes how you think about security permanently. It introduces uncertainty into calculations that once seemed straightforward. It forces constant vigilance and adaptation. In our contemporary world, this lesson resonates perhaps more strongly than ever. The Alexandria Raid was, in essence, an asymmetric attack. A small force using unconventional means to strike a strategically significant target. This pattern has become defining characteristic of modern conflict, from terrorism to cyber warfare to guerrilla operations. The specifics change, but the underlying dynamic remains. Those who cannot compete conventionally will innovate unconventionally, seeking vulnerabilities that defenders have not anticipated or protected. The Italian sailors who rowed chariots into Alexandria could not have foreseen how their actions would echo through subsequent decades. They were focused on immediate objectives, operating within the context of their moment. But their success proved a concept that others would refine and expand, creating new forms of warfare that continue to evolve. Yet we must also acknowledge the limits and costs of such operations. The Alexandria Raid succeeded brilliantly in tactical terms, damaging or destroying multiple major vessels in a single night. But did it change the strategic outcome of the Mediterranean War? The British repaired their battleships, adjusted their defenses, and continued to contest control of the sea. Within months, the broader strategic situation had shifted in ways that made individual raids, however spectacular, relatively minor factors. The entry of the United States into the war, the eventual Allied victories in North Africa, the invasion of Italy itself, these developments overwhelmed whatever temporary advantage the raid provided. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of military effectiveness. Can operations that produce significant immediate results but limited strategic impact be considered truly successful? The men who conducted the raid certainly accomplished their mission and displayed extraordinary courage and skill. But from the perspective of Italy's war aims, Alexandria was a bright moment in an otherwise darkening picture. It could not prevent defeat. It could only delay and complicate it. Moreover, every special operations mission must be weighed against its human cost. Of the 6 men who entered Alexandria Harbor, all were eventually captured. They spent years as prisoners of war, separated from families, missing the remainder of the conflict, watching from confinement as their nation was defeated and occupied. One might argue that their sacrifice was worthwhile, that the ships they damaged represented a valid military objective achieved through legitimate means. But sacrifice is easier to justify in victory than defeat, and Italy's defeat cast the Alexandria Raid in a more ambiguous light. The families of those men experienced the raid as a prolonged agony of uncertainty and absence. In an era before instant communication, news traveled slowly and often incompletely. Parents, wives, children received only sporadic word of their loved one's fate, and always with the knowledge that survival in captivity was no guarantee of return. Some of the raiders did survive to return home after the war. Others did not, lost to disease or accident, or the chaos of conflict's final stages. These human costs rarely feature in the clean narratives of military history, which prefer to focus on tactics, strategy, and outcomes. But they are part of the story, an essential part, because they remind us that behind every operation stood individuals with lives and hopes and futures that the war consumed. The Alexandria Raid was not just a chess move on a strategic board. It was 6 lives wagered, and in some sense lost, for objectives that ultimately proved insufficient. Does this diminish the achievement? Not necessarily. War is a context in which outcomes must be judged by different standards than peacetime. The raiders accomplished a mission of exceptional difficulty. They acted with honor and skill. Within the framework of their war, their nation's needs, and their own understanding, they performed admirably. That the larger war rendered their sacrifice partially futile is a tragedy common to many warriors throughout history. Doing everything right and still being swept aside by forces beyond their control. There is also the question of technological legacy. The human torpedo was, in retrospect, a transitional technology. Innovative for its moment, but soon superseded by more sophisticated approaches. By the 1950s, the development of scuba equipment and improved underwater breathing apparatus made the chariot concept obsolete. Combat swimmers could operate more flexibly without being tied to a large, slow, mechanically unreliable vehicle. The explosive charges became smaller, more powerful, easier to place. What the Decima Flottiglia MS had accomplished with chariots, later generations would achieve with more elegant solutions. Yet, the chariot's very primitiveness was part of what made the Alexandria Raid impressive. The technology was barely adequate for the task. It broke down, ran out of power, malfunctioned at critical moments. Success depended less on the machinery than on the determination and adaptability of the men operating it. When Durand de la Penne's chariot failed, he completed the mission by swimming. When mechanisms jammed, he worked the problem until they freed. The technology was a tool, not a guarantee. This relationship between human capability and technological support remains relevant. Modern Special Operations Forces possess equipment that would have seemed magical to the raiders of 1941: night vision, GPS navigation, encrypted communications, advanced explosives, reliable breathing apparatus. Yet, the fundamental requirements remain unchanged: physical fitness, mental toughness, skill, courage, and the ability to adapt when plans collapse. Technology has improved, but human qualities still determine outcomes. The Alexandria Raid thus stands as a reminder that technology alone does not win wars. It must be wielded by people capable of maximizing its potential and overcoming its limitations. The Italians succeeded not because their chariots were superior machines, they were not, but because the men riding them were exceptionally well-trained and highly motivated. Give those same chariots to less capable operators, and the result would likely have been failure. This lesson applies beyond military contexts. In any competitive endeavor, the latest tools and techniques matter less than the quality of the people employing them. Innovation comes not just from inventing new technologies, but from finding new ways to apply existing capabilities. The Decima Flottiglia MS did not invent the torpedo or the diving suit or the electric motor. They combined these elements in a novel configuration and then trained relentlessly to execute the resulting capability. The innovation was as much organizational and procedural as technological. If we could speak with one of those raiders today, what questions would we ask? How did you maintain focus underwater in total darkness? What did you think about while waiting for the explosion after being captured? Do you regret the warning you gave, or are you proud of it? How did imprisonment change you? What did you tell your children about that night? The historical record preserves facts, but often misses the interior life of those who made history. We know what Durand de la Penne did. We know far less about what he felt, how he processed the experience, how it shaped his understanding of himself and the world. In the decades after the war, he spoke occasionally about the raid, but always in measured terms, focusing on technical details and avoiding emotional revelation. This reticence was typical of his generation, a culture that valued stoicism and discouraged introspection about traumatic experiences. Yet we can infer something from his actions. The decision to warn the British suggests a man who distinguished between necessary military violence and unnecessary killing. The fact that he accepted imprisonment rather than attempt escape suggests acceptance of consequences, a sense of duty completed. His post-war life, by all accounts quiet and modest, suggests someone who did not define himself by his wartime moment, but integrated it into a larger identity. This integration is perhaps the final lesson of the Alexandria Raid. The men who conducted it were warriors for a brief period, but they were human beings before, during, and after. The raid was not the totality of their existence, but a chapter, however dramatic, in longer lives. They returned, those who survived, to families, professions, the ordinary business of living. The skills they had developed, the discipline, the focus, the ability to function under pressure, served them in less dramatic contexts. There is a danger in mythologizing such men, in treating them as superhuman figures rather than recognizing them as ordinary people who performed extraordinary actions under specific circumstances. The truth is more interesting than the myth. These were men with fears and doubts, who trained hard and got lucky and made good decisions when it mattered. They were not born special. They made themselves capable through effort and will. This is a more inspiring story because it suggests possibility rather than predestination. If they could do it, perhaps others can too, in different contexts facing different challenges. The sunrise on December 19, 1941, revealed a harbor transformed. Ships that had seemed invulnerable the night before now sat lower in the water, wounded and listing. British sailors worked frantically to save vessels and assess damage, while security forces swept the harbor for additional threats. In the holding area where the captured Italians were kept, guards watched their prisoners with new respect, tinged with anger. The prisoners, exhausted and uncertain of their fate, waited to see whether they would be treated as soldiers or saboteurs. Far to the west, the submarine Sireh waited at the rendezvous point for teams that would not return. Eventually, accepting the inevitable, the captain turned his boat back toward Italian waters, carrying the knowledge of success without its authors. The mission had worked, but its executors were lost. This bitter calculus, success measured against irreplaceable human cost, defined much of the war's brutal arithmetic. In Rome, when news of the raid reached Italian leadership, there was celebration and propaganda exploitation. Here, finally, was a victory to announce, an achievement to boost civilian morale. The details were embellished, the heroes praised, the implications magnified. For a nation hungry for good news, the Alexandria Raid provided a feast. That the strategic situation remained difficult, that the war was far from won, that this success could not be replicated easily. These realities were set aside in favor of the moment's triumph. And in London, Churchill received reports with concern and grudging admiration. The British Prime Minister understood immediately that this was no minor incident, but a serious breach requiring systematic response. He demanded investigations, improvements, countermeasures, but he also recognized courage when he saw it, even in an enemy. His later comments about the raid reflected this duality, condemnation of the damage combined with respect for the method. This reaction captures something essential about warfare. Between professional military forces who still recognized certain shared values, the Italians had attacked military targets using military means, accepting risk to themselves, acting within the broad conventions of lawful combat. The British, while obviously unhappy about the outcome, could acknowledge that their opponents had fought honorably. This mutual recognition did not prevent the war from being savage in other contexts, but it preserved a thread of humanity in a fundamentally inhumane enterprise. As we conclude this account, we must return to the question implicit in its title. What does it mean that Italian sailors swore their fortress was untouchable, and then found it breached at dawn? The statement is metaphorical. It was British sailors who believed their harbor secure, not Italians, but the sentiment captures a truth about complacency and surprise in warfare. Every fortress is vulnerable. Every defense has gaps. Every assumption of security invites challenge. The history of warfare is largely a history of attackers finding ways through defenses that defenders believed impenetrable. Walls that could not be stormed could be undermined or bypassed. Castles that could withstand siege could be starved into submission. Harbor defenses designed to stop submarines could be penetrated by swimmers. The Alexandria Raid stands as a particular clear example of this eternal pattern. The British had layered defenses, nets, patrols, searchlights, sentries, an entire infrastructure of security. Yet 3 small teams with primitive equipment slipped through because they approached the problem differently than the defenses anticipated. They did not try to overpower. They infiltrated. They did not attack where the defenders were strongest. They found gaps and exploited them. This principle extends far beyond naval warfare. In any competitive domain, those who rely solely on defensive strength eventually meet opponents who redefine the terms of competition. Business monopolies fall to disruptive innovations. Political establishments get overturned by movements that mobilize outside traditional structures. Military doctrines that seem unbeatable prove vulnerable to unconventional approaches. The lesson is not that defense is futile, but that it must be adaptive. The British learned from Alexandria and adjusted their posture. They did not abandon harbor defenses. They made them smarter, more layered, harder to bypass. This iterative process, attack, defense, counterattack, improved defense, drives innovation on all sides. Neither attacker nor defender can rest on past success because the opponent is constantly adapting. For the individuals involved, this grand strategic pattern meant something simpler and more personal. They were asked to do something impossibly dangerous, and they did it. They trained until the impossible became merely very difficult, and then they executed. Some survived, some did not, but all crossed the line that separates those who talk about courage from those who demonstrate it. In the end, we remember the Alexandria Raid not because it changed the outcome of the war, it did not, but because it represents something essential about human capability and determination. 6 men on temperamental machines penetrated defenses designed to stop far more powerful threats. They succeeded not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through skill, planning, courage, and a willingness to accept extraordinary risk. The image of those men riding through the black water toward targets they could barely see, knowing that failure meant death and success might mean capture, knowing that their nation's strategic position was desperate, and this mission could not change that fundamental reality, yet pressing forward anyway, this image resonates across the decades. It speaks to something inhuman, nature that persists regardless of technology or circumstance, the capacity to attempt the nearly impossible and occasionally succeed. The British sailors, who woke to the thunder of explosions they could not explain, learned that morning that nowhere is truly safe, that the enemy can reach you even in your stronghold if he is clever and determined enough. It was a hard lesson, paid for in damaged ships and wounded pride, but it was also a lesson they would eventually turn to their advantage, applying the same principles of unconventional warfare against their adversaries. And the Italian sailors who conducted the raid. They bought their nation a moment of triumph in a war that would end in defeat. They demonstrated that courage and skill could achieve what conventional forces could not. They wrote a chapter in military history that students would study decades later, analyzing their methods and marveling at their audacity. But they also paid the price that special operations have always demanded. Years of imprisonment, separation from loved ones, and the knowledge that their sacrifice, however meaningful, could not prevent the larger tragedy of their nation's collapse. In the cold morning light of December 19, 1941, as British damage control parties fought to save their ships and Italian prisoners sat in makeshift cells contemplating uncertain futures, the Alexandria Harbor held the ruins of assumptions and the seeds of new doctrines. The fortresses we build, whether of steel or stone or strategy, remain vulnerable to those willing to think differently and risk everything. And the men who breach those fortresses, who slip through the darkness toward impossible objectives, who plant their charges and accept the consequences, these men remind us that human will, properly trained and directed, remains the most formidable weapon of all. The harbor lay quiet now, The explosions faded to echoes, the damaged ships settling into new equilibriums. But the night's work had changed more than anchorages and hulls. It had changed what military minds believed possible, had opened new frontiers in the eternal contest between defense and attack, had proven once again that the most dangerous enemy is not the one with the most powerful weapons, but the one with the most innovative mind. And somewhere in the depths, abandoned and out of power, the chariots that had carried those men through the darkness rested on the bottom, their mission complete, their story just beginning to be told.